Jacinda Ardern.
Mr. Speaker. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, for the opportunity to speak to this amendment to the Broadcasting Act, which, alongside the Electoral Act, shapes the rules of the game, as it were, for the election period. Now, this debate today is hot off the tail of the first reading for the electoral amendment, which the Minister flagged, which is already before Select Committee. Given that this is so close to submissions on that bill, it does make sense that we try and progress this bill to Select Committee as quickly as we can. And in part it's because it has had some cursory discussions already by a Select Committee. When we reviewed the general election, as we always do as a committee, there were a number of submissions that spoke to the issue of the, specifically, not the broadcasting allocation, but specifically to the matter we're debating today, which is the use of opening and closing broadcasts. So we have, to a certain extent, already had a few views on this matter. We are now officially putting a solution to the public and to those interested parties and seeking feedback on that. So expediting that discussion back to Select Committee, it does make sense. I also want to flag that there has been conversations outside of the review of the electoral, the general election. My colleague Claire Curran is much closer to those discussions as our broadcasting spokesperson, but there has been specific debate about this very issue within the convergence review. It's a shame that we can't have a quick, almost committee-style format in this House with the Minister to ask a few questions around the overlap of those two items of business, but I'll leave my colleague Claire Curran to talk about that review, because it is pertinent to what we're discussing today. I think the really important point that I want to make, though, Mr. Speaker, is that this bill, and this is what we'll need to check as a Select Committee, this bill is not intended to change any of the rules around electoral broadcasting, bar the fact that we have a specified opening and closing broadcast within the legislation. So we're not proposing that any of the rules around what an election program is, when it's able to be broadcast, the allocation only allocation outside of the fact that we are apportioning a slightly higher amount in lieu of there being an opening and closing broadcast. But generally speaking, we're not intending to change any of those other rules that surround electoral programming and broadcasting. And those rules are there for good reason. Now, in New Zealand, there is a cap on the amount that can be spent for radio and television broadcasting. And we're still suggesting here that a cap should remain. But what this bill proposes is that currently, opening and closing broadcasts are an antiquated way, a restrictive way, to engage with today's voters. And that if the intention is to give registered political parties the ability to put out to the public and to voters a set of policies and ideas, and that be allocated in a fair way, why should we restrict ourselves to one lump of time on one broadcast channel at one specified period during the electoral cycle? If our principle is to engage with voters, that seems like a wholly restrictive way to communicate. And that was a point that was raised by a number of submitters, including the New Zealand Labour Party, where we made the point that actually our engagement online reached far more people than the 2014 opening broadcast, which, if I recall, was in direct contest with an All Blacks fixture. We were doomed from the beginning. So everybody, Chris Bishop, was doomed from the beginning. And don't tell me that the ratings peaked when John Key sat looking at a blank screen with a New Zealand flag behind him, giving us his opening broadcast. So look, they are an antiquated way to communicate with voters, and that's what this bill tries to acknowledge. So what it does is take the allocation of time, turn that into a dollar amount that is then added to the overall broadcast allocation that the Electoral Commission will apportion out to registered political parties. A very simple solution. It will allow that funding to be used for broadcasting, radio, television, or online advertising. And that makes sense. Important to note, though, Caps exist for the amount that are able to be spent on television and radio, but not for print and online. And look, there's good reason for that. That's something, no doubt, that the Select Committee will discuss at greater length. But it's interesting to at least note that difference. So what we as a Select Committee will need to discuss also is the way to make sure we have an even playing field, that parties are given the same access to the same rates relative to each other and relative to the commercial sector. That's something that's been flagged, that we haven't always had comparable rate cards. But we also need to make sure that it is relative to each other, that it is a fair and even playing field. So we'll need to be mindful of what some might try to achieve through bulk discounting. The law is intended to set out that we're all treated equitably, and that is what the Select Committee should be striving to do. I want to point out that TVNZ made a submission to the Select Committee. And this is probably a personal perspective, but I want to put on record that I was not persuaded by an argument by a state broadcaster that they had no duty or role to play in communicating with the general public in election time, and that opening and closing broadcasts should be left to Parliament television. Now, I don't want to leave any disparaging remarks about parliamentary television. It's a very important tool to communicate with the general public. Is it necessarily appointment viewing? Unfortunately, probably not. But actually, increasingly, if you look at a younger demographic, half of that demographic are no longer tuning in for appointment viewing anyway. So we do need to get savvy. And things like My Sky do not allow you to see ads that we are using as a tool to communicate with the public. So we've got to move with the times. So I took issue with TVNZ making that their main rationale for us not dumping the opening and closing broadcast, but simply removing the responsibility that they had. So look, TVNZ, we're doing something that makes sense for the public and for political parties to communicate. But that does not mean that there won't be a responsibility to allow access, but at market rates, access to you as a broadcaster to communicate. So those are just a few opening points that I really wanted to make. I think the suggestions here are sensible. They're in line with where we are in a modern digital world. We will be testing at Select Committee that we have indeed really only done what we intended, which is to merge opening and closing broadcasts into a bit more flexibility, and that we've kept all of those other rules in place. But otherwise, Mr. Speaker, I think the robustest, most important discussion is likely to be held at Select Committee with submitters, making sure we've got this right in time for the next election. Speaker.